Hey guys, it's Alex, and I'm here with another review video. I feel like it's been about a month since I filmed a review video because I tend to pre-film them whenever I finish the book and then just post them as they come up, and I haven't been feeling like filming them lately because it's a lot of work and I always do get very nervous when I film review videos because I do want to do them right. So this review is for a book that I actually don't have anymore, so I will insert the image over here somewhere. I read this book back in August, and I have talked about it a few times on my channel, but I haven't done a full review, so we're going to get into that now. The book is The Lightless Sky by Gulwali Passarlay. It's a non-fiction book about a 12-year-old refugee who escaped Afghanistan and spent a year traveling across the world and trying to get to England. Gulwali Passarlay tells his story of growing up as a young child in Afghanistan and then being ripped away from the family that he loved and everything he'd ever known and the culture he'd grown up in, which he now does recognize there were flaws within that culture, and he does address the misogyny that he felt as a small child growing up in the very patriarchal Afghani Taliban culture. And then he continues as he's essentially trafficked across various countries into Turkey and Iran and eventually Greece, where he decides to leave to continue on to England, which is where his mother told him to go and where he believed his brother might be. It's an incredibly heartbreaking story, and I really did enjoy this book, but I wound up only giving it 3 stars. I wanted to talk about the positives first because I do believe this was an incredibly well done book and incredibly important. It has, I think, a 4.2 rating on Goodreads, which is incredibly high for such a popular book. And I do think it has well earned that rating. First of all, and I think this book's greatest strength lies in its accessibility. It is a book that you can pick up regardless of your prior knowledge on Afghanistan or on refugees or the Taliban or anything in the Middle East. You don't need to have outside knowledge. I read a fair number of memoirs, and I do often find myself having to research outside knowledge. Not always a lot, but I do find myself scrolling through Wikipedia and reading summaries just to get like an overall idea of what's happening and the context for the story. But you really don't need this for The Lightless Sky. I never once had to Google anything for this book, and that is fairly uncommon for a memoir set in and around a place and a culture that I'm not familiar with. He does a wonderful job with explaining his culture and explaining the conflict in his region without hitting anything that would be too difficult or too nuanced to be explained in a few sentences or paragraphs. So I think if you're trying to get into reading more nonfiction or more memoirs or books about refugees and you're trying to sort of start learning about the Middle East or specifically Afghanistan and the Taliban, I think this is a wonderful book to start with. I really think you learn a lot, and I feel like I learned a lot about the refugee experience from this book and his individual story, that I think it's incredibly worth reading for that. His descriptions of his experience as a refugee were so incredibly wonderful and moving. They're so important, and I hadn't read a book that centered around being a refugee before. I have read books about refugees, memoirs about refugees as well. While it does include those aspects, this is the first one I've read where it really focuses on the refugee experience as opposed to the conflict in the country and the culture that he's leaving or his conflict in the country that he's entering. He does hit on both of those issues, but the main bulk of the story is about his experience as a refugee and the year he spent between 12 and 13, essentially traveling around with a group of human traffickers and just constantly hoping that he wasn't going to go to prison or die. Now onto my sort of more negative thoughts and the reason that despite all those positives I just mentioned, I only give this 3 stars. They sort of boil down to the same general point. I think they both sort of stem from that. My first major issue is just a very personal one for me. This story was very descriptive, but I felt like it lacked certain insights, and part of that does have to do with the simplicity and how not dumbed down it is, but it is intended for people who aren't necessarily very knowledgeable on the region or on the experience that he's going through. It's incredibly descriptive of that, and it tells you pretty much everything he went through. But for me, it did lack sort of the insightful edge that I really look for in memoirs like these. I don't just want to learn what the person went through and how they went through it, but I also want to understand more of the why. and I felt this book was a little bit lacking in that, which doesn't make it a bad book. It was just doing something other than what I was looking for. But that did very much impact the rating for me, and I think that was the major reason I gave it 3 stars over 4 stars. I think because it sort of lacked those insights, and it was just him telling his story and describing what he went through, that for me it did feel like this is the kind of thing that won't necessarily still be in my mind in a few years. I don't think I'll be remembering the story as much in a few years. I think part of that is because he was so young when he went through this, and he was only a 12-year-old child, and he was so young when he wrote this book as well. He wrote it when he was, I think, around 19, and I believe it was co-written as well, so he didn't do a lot of the writing himself. But it does just tell the story and not sort of explain why or get more into like the background of how these things are happening. It just described what happened. And the other reason I think he did that, and this gets more into my other main issue, is that he wants to be a politician. His goal is to be the president of Afghanistan. That's not me assuming anything. He literally says this in his author's note, and I think in the end of the book, that his aspiration is to become president of Afghanistan. And that's a fine goal. I have no issues with that whatsoever. He might be a wonderful president. I really don't know much about him or his views. I just know this one specific story he was telling. But I do think that sort of ties in with a lot of the reasons why this book wasn't quite as insightful as it otherwise might have been. Because he wants to be a politician, he's trying not to have too many polarizing views. Obviously, pretty much everything in the Afghanistan region is a polarizing view, but I do think he tried to stay away from certain issues that might turn people against him as a politician. Which brings me into my second major point on this story, and that is that he was a 12-year-old child when he went through all of this, and it's continuously emphasized that he is so young, and he's significantly younger than any of the other men who are being smuggled with him. He's in a group of refugees that are men. The way he describes it is that they're split into 2 groups. They're split into the men who are being smuggled, and they're split into the women and children. And because he's on his own, he's put in with the men, despite the fact that the men, for the most part, seem to be age 16 plus, and he's only 12, and it's constantly made a huge deal how young he is compared to everyone else. I think the other youngest character that he was being smuggled with at any given point in the story was 15 years old, and most of them were significantly older and in their 20s or 30s. And I didn't have an issue with this inherently. He's a young child, that's his story. That's absolutely, I could not have an issue with that, because that's just his story that he's telling. Where it sort of comes into that I had some issues with that was how much he was treated like a leader, not only by himself, but by the other men. There were countless situations that he was in where he would be the one coming up with the ideas. He would be the one who was collecting the money. He was the one that people were turning to and saying, Gulwali, do you have any ideas? Gulwali, what are we going to do? And I don't necessarily think he was lying. I don't think he was lying at all. I don't want it to come across like I think he's making up this story, because I don't. It did ring very much true. I just feel like he was writing that as a politician, the same way many politicians have anecdotes, where they were younger and they were just the natural born leader. And they don't lie about those stories. They just sort of twist them and tell them in ways that make them look like they were more in the leadership role than they were, like they were more inclined to those positions of power than they were. And I sort of got the feeling that Gulwali Passarlay was doing this here. It's not so much that I believe that people wouldn't turn to a 12-year-old or accept his opinions, especially in these difficult situations. It was just the number of times that it happened seemed a little bit too unbelievable, and the fact that there were men in their 20s who would straight turn to him and ask him, what's the plan now? That didn't really ring very true to me. And again, I don't want to make it sound like I think he was lying, because I don't think that at all. It's just the way he was telling those parts of the story did kind of feel like he was just making himself look more like a leader than he actually was, because he's a politician and wants to appear very much like a politician. And the final sort of negative point that I did want to make that wasn't a huge impact on the story, but I did still want to hit on it as just a smaller thing, is that 90% of the book is about the human trafficking journey. It's about him being smuggled across borders. It's about him traveling through Syria, him pretending to be Iranian or an Afghani with a different passport who's allowed to be there. It's about him on a boat trying to get to Greece. It's about the journey, and it's very descriptive, and as a result, it can start to feel like it's... boring's a very strong word for it, but it does start to feel a little bit repetitive, like it's just dragging on a little bit because it is just literally about that story. And he's constantly hungry and dirty and in cramped spaces, and it's very heartbreaking to read, but it does feel like there's a lot of that, and it does kind of start to feel samey after a while, like you're not reading about different experiences, just the same experience continued. I don't think that was a very negative thing. That didn't bother me very much, but it is something that I thought about, and that especially around 2/3 of the way through the book, I was starting to get a little bit tired of the journey. But I also read this over a very short period of time, so I don't think that would be as much of a problem if you're reading it over a couple of weeks, or even just more than 2 or 3 days. And even after all those negatives, I do want to say that I thought this book was very worthwhile. I'm very glad I read it, and I was on the fence between giving it 3 or 4 stars, but I think overall it just wasn't a book that's going to stick with me for a very long period of time. I still remember it very well several months later, and I think I will into next year, but in another year or two, I don't know that this is going to be a book that I'm going to remember much from or have retained anything that I feel is very worthwhile or important. Like I said at the beginning, I think the strengths of this book lies in its accessibility. If you're trying to get into reading books like this and you're sort of nervous about not knowing much about the different regions or about the refugee experience or just in general not knowing where to start, I think this is a wonderful book to start with, and I think you would really, really enjoy it. It has a really high rating on Goodreads for a reason, and I would highly recommend this. I think if you're more like me and you're looking for a book that's more insightful, or if you're already fairly aware of what's going on in Afghanistan or what the refugee experience is like, you might not get as much from it, but I don't think you're going to dislike this book. It was something that I found incredibly good to read, and I've recommended it a few times in top 5 videos, and I've done that for a reason. This was a 3-star read, but it's a 3-star read that I think I just wasn't the specific audience for, but I think a lot of people are. Let me know down below if you read The Lightless Sky and what you thought of it if you did. I'm always curious to hear your guys' opinions on the books that I read and the reviews that I do. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys again soon. Bye!